In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Astropathic transmission. Incoming. Receiving. Receiving. Astropathic transmission. Received. Ident marker. Rho. Alpha. Alpha. 86449. Theta. Origin source. Holy terror. Destination. Classified by orders of the Inquisition. Instruction. Transmit to Bastion Station Tarvial. Ultima Segmentum. Tarsus Sector. Message begins.
Inquisitor Man, in the centuries since your departure from Holy Terror, I have diligently followed your orders to the letter, my lord, and I trust that your continued communications with me are a demonstration that you find my work acceptable for your needs. Please find attached to this astrotelepathic communique a series of documents pertaining to the Bulls of Retribution of the Gudan Sector, as you have requested. I believe it would benefit you, my lord, to understand that accessing this information brought me to the intention of various members of your ordo, as well as several inquisitors who purported to be your rivals. Thankfully, due to my nature as an attaché to your cohort, I was spared the worst of their attentions, but I would beg my lord to be cautious. Clearly, the secret of the Bulls of Retribution Guard is one of dire import, even in an age of chaos and strife as such as ours. I pray to the God Emperor that this message reaches you with full integrity of data and with its sanctity unmarred. May the God Emperor protect you and your works, my friend. The Archivist Premier.
Report begins.
It is an age of strife and war. Long has the Imperium been beset by enemies, both within and without. Since the crippling of the Emperor and the death of the arch-traitor Horus, the Imperium has seen no end to the conflict that embroils the galaxy. On 1,000,000 worlds and 1,000,000,000 battlefronts, the Imperium is pressed both within and without by those who desire nothing more than to fully bring about the end to the rotting, bloated carcass that is the Imperium. Hungry, alien eyes gazing from the darkness as the domain of man takes its final, laboured breaths. Yet mankind does not intend to go quietly into the oblivion that awaits. On every battlefront across the stars, the Astra Militarum deploy men beyond counting. Tides of humanity so thick as to reach the horizon, thrown as bloody grist into the mill of war. Yet wherever the fighting is thickest, wherever the need is most dire, there you may find the warriors that truly exemplify the fighting spirit of mankind. There you may find the Space Marines. Located deep within the depths of Imperium Nihilus, on the very edge of the Astronomican's former limits, there exists a chapter who has fought and bled for the Imperium for over 4,000 years, each day of their existence mired in the blood of their enemies. To be a Space Marine is to be an exemplar of humanity, one of the finest warriors in the species' history, born to fight and die upon the eternal battlefields of mankind with all the fury and violence of that race. The Bulls of Retribution embrace this existence, for violence and conflict ran deep through their veins long before the Imperium declared their ancestors to be worthy of apotheosis. Theirs is a brief history, yet nonetheless bloody for it, for every day has seen the chapter wage war upon the enemies of man with unremitting violence. In this dark age, chaos swirls all around, corrupting the minds of men and seeking always to bend the future to its will. In such a time, the need of the Imperium for heroes is dire, and in the benighted darkness of Imperium Nihilus, in that place where the light of the Emperor is no longer to be found, the Bulls of Retribution tend and keep the flame of the Imperium alive, raging against the darkness around them, even as it encroaches ever closer. In the tides of war to come, none may gainsay who will survive, if any. Yet it is all the more for that reason that I lay down these records now, to preserve, in some small part, an ember of the spirit of man from the coming darkness. For none but the master of mankind know the destiny of the human race, and upon his golden throne, the Corpse Emperor speaks not.
Report. Section 1. Alpha. The War in Heaven. The Formation of Gods. And the Ancient Eldari.
Mankind is not alone amidst the stars. Since the earliest days of human spaceflight, mankind has shared the stars with endless streams of Xenos, each as perfidious a threat to the future of man as the traitors and chaos mutants that bay at the edges of reality, eternally hungry for the souls of men. Yet mankind is not the first race to strike the cosmos. Far from it. Indeed, far older and far more malevolent powers have drifted across the stellar waste since the dawn of time. Some, like the elegant Eldari, were once rulers of star-bound empires of their own, their sciences so advanced as to be arcane ritual, beyond even the brightest of mechanic and adepts' abilities to comprehend. Others, like the barbaric orcs, have scourged the galaxy from before even the earliest known records. Since its first tentative explorations beyond Sol, has man had to deal with the fearsome Greenskin and his ilk. In the Stygian blackness of the lost past, within the depths of those horrors contained by history, there is a conflict at the dawn of creation that shook the universe to its foundations. A war of such awesome and destructive proportions that even today the galaxy still feels the effect of the battle upon its scarred flesh. It is known as the War in Heaven. A legendary hyper-conflict of unimaginable proportions, the War in Heaven was said to be a war for more than survival. It was a war of complete and total destruction. Fought between the forces of the enigmatic Old Ones and their psychically crafted children, opposed against those of the star-consuming Catan and their enslaved hordes of Necrontyre. It was a conflict that would permanently scar creation, such was the might of the weapons used and the destructive nature of the energies unleashed. Planets burned, stars died, and real space was torn to shreds beneath the psychic weight of the bloodshed and violence as it seeped into the Immaterium, disturbing its placid depths for the first time. After millennia of conflict and countless battles lost to time, the war came to a close with the death of the Old Ones, the sealing of the Catan, and the retreat of the newly forged Necrons into their vast stasis tombs. Such is the nature of so distant a conflict that we have nothing more than legends and the words of Xenos to rely upon, and all of my Adepta know that such things are not to be treated with any veracity, lest the chronicles of man be polluted by Xeno tongue. Regardless, what we can say with some certainty is that those races whom partook in the bloodshed, only the Eldari survived, the sole inheritors of a galaxy scourged of life. Such was the brutality of the conflict that the very warp itself had become disturbed by the horrors unleashed, twisting that once calm dimension into the first inklings of the psychic hellscape that exists today. From within came boiling the first astral predators, the first conceptions of the entities you or I would know as demons. Multitudinous were their names: the Enslaver Plague, the Psychnoia, the Hraxnor, yet their purpose was the same: to ravage real space and feast on the souls of the mortals they found there. Such was it that the Eldari spent their first millennia in their newfound isolation, sealing back the rents in reality. Such tasks that would today seem an impossibility, achieved in seconds by a race at the very height of its psychic and technological prowess. Oceans of madness were turned back. The proto-demons of warp space returned to their hellish cradle, to plot and scheme and curse the mortals who would deny them. Yet it was during this time that the Eldari of the ancient empire encountered what they would one day come to know as the shape of the nightmare to come. It was during these benighted centuries they encountered the first warp god. Knowledge of the astral predators is a dangerous thing to possess, for the mere act of knowing of such a creature's existence is enough to draw its ire from across the dimensions. Though to the common herd of the Imperium, a demon is little more than an object of superstitious fear, known only through the parable and sermon of the Ministorum's preachers, there are those within the wider Imperium to whom the duty is entrusted to not only study these creatures, but hunt, and if needs must, capture them for the Imperium's own ends. Thus it is that mankind has come into possession of some small shard of the knowledge that is to be gleaned from studying warp space, and the maddening entities that writhe like maggots through its rotting flesh. A warp god is a psychic amalgam, a confluence point at which certain emotions and psychic signatures gather by virtue of their similarity in nature and intent. To fully describe the workings of these processes would be impossible, for they are unknown to the guardians of the Imperium, and to comprehend them would be to court damnation of the soul. Yet by means and ways unseen, these emotions and signatures begin to compound upon each other, similar to how layer upon layer of grit solidifies through pressure to become rock, until they are not a disparate collection of psychic emanations, but a single, unified whole, separate from the rest of warp space and conscious as to its ability to differentiate itself from the surrounding miasma of thought and emotion. Such confluences can only be created around precise and differentiated concepts. A nascent warp god in development must be able to begin to differentiate itself from the unspecialized warp energy that surrounds it if it is to take on aspects of individual consciousness and identity. In the modern era, the four Chaos Gods of the Ruinous Powers are excellent examples of this, as each god is clearly and deliberately separated from its fellows by a specific fulcrum of power, modus of worship, and individual desire. However, in the primordial eras 2 and immediately following, the War in Heaven, the nature of the Immaterium and the entities that resided within it were vastly altered to the behaviors that they exhibit today. In the era of the modern Imperium, the warp is a nightmarish and disjointed reality, a hellscape forged from the psychic trauma of a galaxy at war. Within its depths lie madness that would destroy the mind and soul in but a heartbeat, a sickly and corrupted core where dwell within the four Chaos Gods of the Ruinous Powers, titans of madness and corruption that seek always to entrap and devour the souls of men. Yet it was not always so. If legend to be believed, in the days before the War in Heaven, the warp was not a hellscape, but merely an inert dimension of psychic energy that ran parallel to ours, an earthly reflection of the physical universe mirrored in pure energy. Unlike today, the warp energy of that time could be harnessed without the soul-devouring properties of our own era, and as such could be utilized for galaxy-spanning feats of engineering and grandeur, such as the legendary Rebway, the Old Ones. However, along with the destruction unleashed by the Catan and the Old Ones, came the first signs of corruption as well, for as the battle raged on, evermore did the emotions and turmoil of the mortals caught in the maelstrom pollute the warp with their fear and hatred, causing the first distortions of warp space, and within it, the first of the proto-demons, to spawn. For long millennia, the war continued, the psychic weight pressing upon the Immaterium, rising and rising as the bloodshed unleashed forever tainted its core. As the War in Heaven reached its conclusion, the distortions of the warp began to reach saturation levels, and the first stirrings of true primordial warp gods began to rumble from within the depths. For while demons may manifest themselves around even the most simple of concepts and ideas, it takes an altogether consistent and specific formulation of ideal and intent to form a warp god, and the long millennia of the War in Heaven had been time enough for this first nascent warp entity to gestate within its dark womb of insanity and bloodshed. Alone, and without their creators to guide them, the Eldari took the battle to this nascent warp god, for even though the War in Heaven had sapped them of their strength, these Eldar of the ancient empire, compared to their kin of the modern era, were far from the faint shadows of power that they currently wield, and with all the psychic knowledge of their race, they warred with this creature for generations. Of these battles, we have only conjecture, as even amongst the Eldari themselves, it would seem that these events are merely myth. But it is told that a great warrior of the Empire lured the demon into reality by offering it the honey treat of a star in the primary sequence of its life cycle, a potent source of energy to a creature that sought to dominate the material realm. Slipping into real space, the nascent warp god realized too late, even as its gaping maw sought to devour the star, that it had been deceived by the tiny creatures that flitted around it in ships of metal and light. As one, the great psyches of the Eldari fleet that moved to attack the warp god raised their voices, and such was their combined power that they managed not only to sever the demon god's connection to the warp, but to physically bind it to the star it sought to eat in its totality, entrapping the beast within a perfect cage of fusion, gravity, and the roiling energies of creation. The beast howled from within its cage, cursing the mortals to damnation, yet for all it caused and for all its rage, within the star cage, the nascent warp god was utterly isolated from its source of power, and left with naught to devour but itself. The Eldari paused only briefly to congratulate themselves on their victory before turning away, for there were many battles yet to come before they were to enter their golden age and become the true inheritors of the Old One's legacy. Yet for now, victory had been achieved, and though their scryers had only the briefest glimpses of the future and its twisting paths, already they could see the destiny of the Eldar people turning away with the sealing of this nascent warp god, and moving from a place of darkness towards the light. Wishing to ensure that no mortal could find the star prison without great difficulty, the Eldari placed psychic baffles upon the star, masking its gravitational shadow within the warp and making it undetectable to all save the most skilled of Empiric navigators. From here, we return to the main current of history. The Eldari Empire would rise and continue to dominate the galaxy for nearly 60 million years, until their descent into decadence and the creation of their own damnation. And all the ages of man would come to pass, untroubled by the secrets that the galaxy had forgotten in those dark eons. Yet as the Great Crusade came to a close, and the War Master Horus turned from the face of his father to join the ruinous powers, demonic tongues whispered into the traitors' ears of weapons that could be turned on the Loyalists, and of those ancient beings who could be enlisted to the cause, if only they could be released from their prisons.
Report, Section 1, Beta, the Horus Heresy, Narrador the Slighted.
The event known as the Horus Heresy was perhaps the most defining instance in the whole history of man. Never before or since have the actions of humanity had so drastic an effect on the course of destiny. Who could have truly predicted the sheer scale of the catastrophe the War Master would unleash upon the galaxy? Who can dare to dream what future may have awaited if chaos had failed to bury its claws so deeply into the Primarch's mind? A full recounting of the entire event is not publicly available to my adepta, as the Ordos of the Inquisition lay tight claim to any knowledge pertaining to that era. Yet, as the archivist assigned to the creation of this report for your benefit, my Lord Inquisitor Man, I have been given access to those documents relating to the events that would later transpire in the as yet unnamed Gudan Sector. According to those records and documents I have been able to salvage, along with the ancient reports given to me by the Inquisition, the events that occurred within the Gudan Sector were set into motion when the Ruin Storm was unleashed upon the galaxy. Much as the Circuitrix Maledictum would later carve the God Emperor's Imperium in twain, the Ruin Storm made travel between Ultima Segmentum and Segmentum Solar impossible, and warped reality for light years around with a devastating cascade of warp energy that caused reality itself to curdle and sour. This release of nightmarish essence rippled across real space until it poured over the surface of the ancient Eldari star prison. Dormant for millions of years, the demon inside had been rendered inert by the perfection of its cage, bound so tightly that not even the faintest sliver of its being could slip free, and not even the smallest trickle of warp energy could come in to feed it. Yet as the bow wave of the Ruin Storm release washed over it, the arcane prism of the star cage buckled under the psychic weight, ever so minutely. Yet that tiniest instant was all the warp god needed to spirit an insignificant shard of itself out into the greater void of the galaxy. Seeking always to free itself from celestial confinement, and desiring nothing more than to return to warp space so as to gestate and return to its former state of power, the god shard flitted across physical reality at the speed of thought, senses alert for some means of opening its prison from without. All about, real space had greatly altered to the dimension that had previously existed when the warp god had last slipped into reality, existence itself having been rent and torn asunder by millions of years of further strife, war, and bloodshed. Everywhere the void echoed with the demonic taint of the immaterium, bleeding through to make a mockery of physics and distort creation. Not the as yet fully untainted energy that the nascent warp god had been reared on, but wholly and fully bent to the maddening winds of the ruinous powers. Realizing this energy was tainted sufficiently for its purpose, and that should it be able to apply sufficient levels of this energy to the prison that it would shatter in its entirety, the God Shard determined that it needed only to find a focus point through which to deliver such a tide of warp energy, and a mortal with the cruelty and will to facilitate such a ritual. Fortunately for the God Shard, at the time of its escape, the dire events of the Horus Heresy were unfurling across the length and breadth of the galaxy, and there were more than enough damned souls seeking leverage over the Loyalists who would listen all too willingly to a voice from the warp. Thus it was that the God Shard found its way to the bridge of the Night Lord battle barge Writhing Worm, and whispered honeyed promises into the ears of the chaotic sorcerer it found there, Narrador the Slighted. Seeking to indulge himself with the War Master's inner circle, and knowing that Horus Lupercal sought a great weapon to aid in the invasion of Terra, Narrador listened with mounting, horrific glee as the God Shard laid out the requirements for the breaking of its chains. Narador needed only to locate and capture an Alpha Primaris Psyker, an incredibly rare and powerful individual, and bring it to the Gudan Sector, where he would conduct a ritual that would open the star cage the smallest fraction and allow the warp god inside to possess the Psyker, who would then use the mortal puppet to force open the rest of the cage and return once more to devour real space. Realizing the glorious potential of the plan, and ruminating privately about what reward such a creature would have for the mortal that freed it, Narador the Slighted gathered those battle brothers under his command and set out with a fleet of ships to hunt the required Alpha Primaris Psyker, the vast battle barge writhing worm at the fleet's head. For several long months, the Night Lord traitors conducted raids and skirmishes against Imperial facilities along the edge of the Ultima Segmentum, striking those locations where the Loyalists could possibly contain such a creature, as the powers of an Alpha Primaris Psyker are beyond even their own ability to control, and only a handful of installations would have had the equipment available to safely keep such a being contained. As the final year of the heresy dawned, Narador finally located his quarry upon the classified Imperial facility world of Simoon Calyx, whose surface was riven by psychically reactive crystalline materials. Slaughtering all within, Narador abducted the raving Psyker from her shielded cell and spirited her back to the writhing worm that awaited in orbit. By the time elements of the Imperial Fists which had been operating in the area responded to the installation's distress hymnals, the trail of Narador had grown near cold.
Report. Section 1, Gamma. Captain Tarsus, the Battle of Gudan.
Under normal circumstances, picking up a warp trail so old would have been a fool's errand. Yet Captain Tarsus, leader of the Imperial Fists battle group, and fresh from his battles with the traitors and their newly found demonic allies, was all too aware of the destructive potential of a Psyker as a weapon, and considerably alarmed by the prospect of such traitors fielding an Alpha Primaris Psyker against Loyalist forces. Such a being would be nigh impossible to oppose, and even then, only at great cost of life. Charging his navigator with locating Narador's warband, the Imperial Fists dived headfirst into the warp, baying at Narador's trail like bloodhounds to a scent. The journey was a battle in and of itself, as the path of Narador led to the very furthest limits of the Astronomican's light, and so far from the guidance of Terra's holy beacon, the warp was a nightmarish maze that threatened to consume the Loyalists with every jump. Only thanks to the legendary determination of their gene sire did the Sons of Dawn survive, even as some ships of the fleet were lost entirely to the tides of the Immaterium, until, at last, the navigator reported the presence of a warp shadow in the Immaterium, the telltale signature of a star's gravitational bulk as it pulls at reality, though this signature was so small that it seemed to barely register. Trusting his gut instinct, Tarsus ordered his ships to drop out of warp space, and was rewarded for his faith with the sight of Gudan's primary star burning in the void, bright and flushed in the main sequence of its life cycle. For the first time, the forces of the Imperium beheld the Gudan system, and there, pinging on the Auspex scans as they ranged ahead of the fleet, was Writhing Worm in high orbit above the star. Ordering his battle brothers to prepare for boarding actions, Tarsus had his battle group ready formation and engage the enemy. The forces of the Night Lords had arrayed themselves in a protective formation around Writhing Worm, shielding the battle barge from enemy fire. This in and of itself gave Tarsus pause, as a battle barge is a great tactical asset in void combat, and for the traitors to do anything other than place the vessel at the head of their formation struck the captain as simply wrong. Realizing that something of a fouler nature beyond his comprehension was afoot, Tarsus ordered his bodyguard to make ready. He would personally lead the assault upon Writhing Worm, and discover for himself the intentions of his traitorous brethren. Forming his battle group into a spearhead, Tarsus ordered his fleet to punch into the heart of the enemy and disable Writhing Worm, seeking to cut the rotten heart from the Night Lord's operation and put a halt to their plans. The void rippled with plasma fire as the two fleets approached engagement distance, macro batteries and lance positions exchanging salvo upon salvo as the Imperial Fists plunged into the heart of the enemy, led by Tarsus's own command ship, the battle barge Penitence. Forcing aside the Night Lord's shield elements, the Imperial fleet broke through the enemy formation, Penitence spitting death as she unleashed her full complement of melter torpedoes upon Writhing Worm, the salvo fired too close for the enemy ship to outmaneuver. Crippling his enemy with a single blow, Tarsus ordered the boarding torpedoes launched, rocketing across the void with his men to pierce the adamantine hull of the ship and bring death to those within. Yet even as the Astartes raced towards their target, the star beneath them began to bleed. Unbeknownst to the Imperial Fists, Narrador was wholly preoccupied with his ritual, even as the void battle raged about the writhing worm. At the very same instant as Tarsus crossed to the enemy ship, Narrador had managed to work open the smallest weakness of the star cage, and rising from within came the essence of the bound warp god, eager and hungry to possess the Primaris Psyche's flesh and fully release itself to terrorize warp space and reality once more. Staining the pure fire of the Gudan star with its demonic taint, the demon began to bind itself to the mind of the Psyche, puppeting the mortal as a focus for its own energy, seizing the star cage and forcing the wound ever wider open. Baying with victory, Narrador believed the deed was all but done, until the boarding torpedo of Captain Tarsus came punching through the writhing worm's adamantine hull, delivering the Loyalists into the very heart of the enemy. Instantly battle raged as Loyalist and traitor fought with only the hatred that brothers know, slaughtering one another with wild fury. Sighting the Alpha Primaris Psyche at the back of the melee, eyes alight with demonic power and flesh pulsing with unnatural energy, Tarsus realized that his forces may have already been too late to prevent the traitor's machinations coming to fruition. Discarding the notion of personal survival, Tarsus laid into the enemy with furious abandon, his warhammer buckling plate and dashing skulls as it forged a path for his brothers through the traitor scum. Seeing the Loyalist captain inch ever closer, and knowing the ritual was yet to complete, Narrador threw himself into the path of the Imperial Fist, unleashing the entirety of his psychic might upon Tarsus, tearing the flesh from half of his skull with a single horrific projection of power. Tarsus staggered under the blow, half his face flensed clean, and the bone beneath crushed and pulped, blood seeping from every orifice as he collapsed to his knees. About him, his bodyguards sought to intervene, circling their captain for his defense, even as they were cut down in the bloody melee. Above them all, the Psyche began to steadily rise, her flesh tearing and pulsing where the power of the demon spurred unnatural growth and mutation, the writhing worm itself screaming with strain as warp energy began to radiate through its very being. The ritual was approaching its final, terrifying conclusion. Knowing he had but seconds remaining, Tarsus rose to his feet, lurching from left to right as his pulped brain struggled to function so close to death. Unleashing from his chest one final, fearsome roar of defiance, Tarsus charged forward, even as Narrador cut down the last of his bodyguard, his thunder hammer smashing aside the Chaos Sorcerer before, with the last of his energy, Tarsus pulled back his arm and launched the weapon skyward, the hammer spinning end over end before the flat of its head ploughed straight into the Alpha Primaris Psyche, the accompanying release of energy blowing the demonically possessed flesh apart in a shower of viscera and gore. As the raging screams of the demon rang through the void, Tarsus realized he had achieved victory, and allowed a savage bark of laughter to cross his bloodied lips before he fell to Narrador, slumping lifeless to the deck of the writhing worm with his brethren. In the instant of the Psyche's death, the gaping wound of the star cage snapped shut, the demon raging within as its plan was foiled. Within the dead husk of the Psyche, the god shard that had slipped free desperately searched for a new living host to survive, and seized upon the first escape it saw, the psychically active mind of Narrador. Possessing the Chaos Sorcerer, the god shard howled with fury as the Loyalist forces brought ruin to the remaining ships of the Night Lord fleet, writhing worms' shield elements falling like wheat before the scythe. Yet even as freedom slipped from its grasp, the god shard realized that enough of its essence had bonded with the Alpha Primaris Psyche to infuse its mortal host with the ability to open the star cage regardless of psychic ability, and that if it could effect an escape, there yet remained the possibility of returning at a later date. Seizing control of Narrador's confused and desperate warband, the god shard ordered Writhing Worm to break from the battle, make for the system's Mandeville point, and jump into the warp, leaving the remaining Night Lord ships to die in the face of the Loyalist onslaught. A cowardly move, but befitting of the slaves of chaos. From here, Writhing Worm would disappear from history for millennia, returning over the centuries across the Imperium as a vast and ever-growing space hulk, each appearance rendering it more misshapen and twisted than the last.
Report. Section 1, Delta. The Settlement of Gudan.
In the wake of the battle, and the death of their captain, the Imperial Fists recorded the incident within their archives, gathered their honoured dead, and left the Gudan system for Holy Terror, seeking to reunite with their battle brothers for the final confrontation against Horus. Though they had emerged from the battle victorious, none of the survivors were aware as to the full nature of what had unfurled upon Writhing Worm, and no survivors had returned from the vessel before it disengaged with Loyalist forces to tell the tale. Yet still, many had witnessed the gaping wound in the Gudan star, and had also seen it snap shut in a mere instant, and all knew something of dire import had been prevented by their captain, even if the specifics of his valour could not be committed to the records of the chapter. Though the reports made by the Imperial Fists were marked as high priority for investigation upon their reunion with the Imperium, it would be centuries yet before the new-formed Inquisition would begin an investigation as to the exact nature of the Gudan star and what the Night Lords had sought to achieve there. First, the Imperium would have to bear the great loss of the Emperor, his Primarchs, and the death of hope for the future of mankind. It would not be until M32 that an Imperial ship, the Inquisition vessel Gallowtree, returned to the Gudan system. The investigation by the Inquisition yielded many interesting and dire results for the Imperium to contend with. The first of which was that contained within the Gudan star was what could only be described as a proto-warp god, an unrefined, devolved form of the four ruinous powers that had laid low the master of mankind and fouled the destiny of the human race. From trace energy left in high orbit around the debris of the Night Lord's fleet, the Inquisitors were also able to determine that some small piece of the demon god had been able to slip loose from its prison, and likely escaped out into the wider void of the galaxy. Knowing that this left the possibility of the traitors returning to the system a wholly likely reality, the Inquisition moved for immediate settlement of the Gudan system as a bastion facility, designed with the sole intention of fortifying the star and holding at bay those forces that sought to release its prisoner from its cage. Under normal circumstances, settlement so close to a demonic entity would have been impossible, yet such was the perfection of the star cage that the demon's corruption was totally contained, and those worlds in orbit of the star existed without mutation and deviancy. Another aiding factor to such colonization efforts were revealed when Auspex scans uncovered the ruins of human structures from the Dark Age of technology upon the surface of Gudan Prime, a planet within the star's Goldilocks zone, and that a viable human population had existed there for over 6,000 years of isolation without major deviancy from baseline human genetics. So it was that in M33, an Imperial crusade was launched to establish the Gudan Sector, with the Gudan system and star at its very heart, shielded from traitor influence by whole star systems dedicated to its defense. Though the fact that the sector existed solely to protect a demonic star was known only to a handful within the Ordo Malleus and the planetary governor of Gudan Prime, the sector flourished, and for 5,000 years was a bastion of loyalty and faith on the furthest edges of Ultima Segmentum, guarding the Emperor's domain against those horrors from beyond his light. The centuries slipped by, and as all things are, the exact nature of the creature that slumbered within the Gudan star was lost to history, known only to those scribes charged with keeping the records in the vast vaults of terror. Only the Imperial Fists truly remembered what had occurred in high orbit above Gudan, and the name Writhing Worm. So it was that in 025 M38, when the Space Hulk was sighted breaking warp in the Gudan sector, the Sons of Dawn responded with all haste. For 4 chaotic gods already assailed the Imperium, and they knew that were a fifth to join their number, the balance would be irrevocably turned to the forces of madness and carnage.
Report ends. Beginning projection of astrotelepathic communication to Bastion Station Tarviel, Ultima Segmentum, Tarsus Sector. Transmitting. 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 Transmission successful. Augurs indicate 46.2% chance of message arrival with data integrity intact. These odds are deemed acceptable. Powering down astrotelepathic transmitter. returning to hibernation status. Remember, the God Emperor protects.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, and that was the project. I hope you enjoyed. As always, big thanks to my friend Tactical Keeper for helping me with the editing. It really would not have been possible without him. And a big thanks to all of the producers of the artwork we used. Obviously, we used a lot of artwork in this, and at the time we didn't quite take down pains to look for sources. So I'd just like to thank everyone whose artwork we used in this. Thank you very much for creating it, and of course we take no credit for this artwork or credit to the original producers. I hope you'll be around for the rest of the project and that you guys enjoyed what you saw. Thank you very much for your support. Have a good day.